Hi everyone, great to be here. Before I start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we're sitting on today, and acknowledge elders past, present and emerging. So I love talking about renewable energy, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit around what are the opportunities and what is happening globally and here in Australia to really transition away from gas. I wouldn't say it's happening quickly, but it is certainly happening. If there was one thing I want you to remember out of this talk, it's that how do we do this? How do we actually get off gas? Well, the first ingredient is cheap renewable energy. The second ingredient is we start to electrify our industries, our homes and our businesses. So cheap renewables combined with electrification means that gas becomes redundant. So as Bruce was talking about, we use gas in 4 sectors in Australia. We export it, that's the largest chunk up there. Then the orange chunk that sort of wobbles around a bit, that is our the gas we use in our electricity system. The yellow chunk is what we use in our homes and our small business, the mass market. And then the bottom chunk, the black chunk, is the industrial use, so for manufacturing. Yeah? So what I'm going to talk through today is, well, how do we get off gas in those 4 sectors? What are the alternative clean energy opportunities and what's already happening? And I'm going to start with electricity because electricity is the bedrock of doing everything else. So even though electricity is really now the smallest aspect of our gas use in Australia, making renewable energy be the main source of our power supply is the way that we clean up our industry and our households and our exports at the same time. Yeah? So, how do we replace gas in the power sector? Gas power plant, they're very attractive. So around the world, in the electricity sector, we have a choice. We're standing at a crossroads. And that choice is no longer a choice between dirty energy and clean energy. It's a choice about how we transition to clean energy. Because the transition to clean energy is now inevitable. Will that transition be slow, messy, bumpy, leave a lot of people behind, exploit a lot of gas fields that are unnecessary? Or will it be quick, affordable, and deliver as many jobs for regional Australia as possible, and ensure that no one is left behind, no matter where they live, no matter how much they earn? That is the choice presented to us in the electricity sector. And the reason I say that this transition is now inevitable is for about 5 reasons. The first is cost. So, complicated graph. These are the costs of different types of electricity technologies under different scenarios, and this is to build a new power plant. So these ones here on the left-hand side, they're coal, brown coal, black coal, brown coal and gas. Yeah? Way on the other side, wind and solar backed up by batteries, wind and solar backed up by pumped hydro. Renewables are about half as expensive as building a new coal or gas plant. This is a study from CSIRO and the Australian Energy Market Operator. It came out just before Christmas. And then on loan, just ask BHP, ask BlueScope Steel, Sun Metals, the Sydney Opera House, Woolworths. All of these companies are currently in the market to contract for new power, and they're doing it from renewable energy. In California, just 3 weeks ago, or 2 weeks ago, they had a contract for new solar panels or solar power, large scale with batteries, and it came in at about 2.5 cents a kilowatt hour Australian. We at the moment in our energy system pay about somewhere between 8 to 12 cents a kilowatt hour for just generating electricity. So this is really cheap technology. The economics have changed. And one of the reasons that they've changed is that the technologies of the future that are, and it's not just of the future, that are here now, solar PV, wind, batteries, they're modular technologies. So they go on a cost curve like your mobile phones or your computer, your consumer items. So that means when you install a lot of solar energy, you reduce the cost significantly. Basically, you're halving the price for almost every doubling of global output. So that curve is powerful, and you ask most financial investors about 7 or 8 years ago, they would have laughed you out of the room if you'd said solar was the big thing of the future, because it was coming out of the sky, like a lightning bolt. Maybe 10 years ago now. So that's the first reason. The economics have changed and they are going to continue to change. The second reason is we have ageing coal-fired power stations in this country and this state. We have 5 coal-fired power stations in New South Wales. They supply about 80% of our electricity. 4 of them are due to shut in the next 16 years. Liddell, just down the road, will shut in 2022. These are old coal-fired power stations. Coal-fired power stations generally work well until they're about 35 to 40 years old if they've been built well. And the most recent coal-fired power stations built in Queensland were not built well. So they probably have a design life of more like 25 to 30 years. We're pushing out and assuming that coal-fired power stations can operate at least until they're 50 years old, and they're breaking down. In Victoria at the moment, 4 coal units are out of operation. 2 of them will be out of operation for 7 months. We need to replace our ageing generation fleet in Australia. And what are we going to replace them with? We're going to replace them with the cheapest form of new generation, and that is solar and wind backed up by storage. Third, this is happening globally. What you're starting to see, we've been powering our global electricity systems by fossil fuels for a very long time. But what we're seeing is the gradual replacement of fossil fuels with renewable energy. So in 2014, that was the first year globally where more renewable energy was built than fossil fuel power stations. And that replacement curve is continuing. So if you want to transition to renewable energy, it's going to happen. That replacement will happen over time. The question is, will it happen quickly enough? And I'm going to get back to that. And it's happening on an exponential growth curve. Renewables, new renewables like solar and wind, generate somewhere between 2.5% or 3% of global electricity needs right now. That is very small. In fact, that stat's a couple of years old now. The thing is because you're on an exponential growth curve, it actually only requires 5 doublings to get to 100% renewables. And we're currently doubling the installation of renewable energy every 2.5 years. So we're only talking about 15 years or thereabouts if we continue this exponential growth curve trend. And that is a big if, but it's something that we can do. And it's something that we've already done because we've doubled seen the exponential growth curves of things like those computers and the mobile phones that we all have in our pockets. Fourth reason this is inevitable, particularly in Australia, is we have the best renewable energy resources in the world. Look at that. Look at the amount of pink and red in Australia. We are the sunburnt nation, and that is a blessing. Not only do we have some of the best renewable energy resources in the world, we have a huge land mass, we have a low population base, and we have a low manufacturing base compared to other countries, which means that not only can we repower ourselves really easily, we can help our neighbours. I want you to have a look at Japan and South Korea. Not a lot of sunshine, not a lot of land area, a lot of people, a lot of manufacturing. How are they going to decarbonise? We might need to give them some help, and that's when I'm going to talk about exports. Fifth reason, Australians love renewable energy. Who here has solar on their roof? Who here would like solar on their roof? Yeah, so you're not alone. There are 2.1 million Australian households that have solar on the roof. That is the highest in the world. I was in the US a few years ago, and US has, what, a population more than 10 times the population of Australia. They had 1 million solar roofs. Not even. We are leading the world in this because it makes sense. And it's not just households that are leading the charge. I work in community renewables, where I support communities to set up, own and operate renewable energy projects for the benefit of their community. When I first started doing this properly in about 2010, there were 5 community energy groups across the country. There are 105 now. Some great stuff happening in Uralla, in Newcastle, in Northern Rivers. I wanted to tell you one quick story because I don't want to show you all graphs. People know the town of Yakandanda in northeast Victoria? Pretty great place. They invited me down in about 2014, 2015 to come and give a talk about community renewables. From there, they decided that they were going to commit to powering their town with 100% renewables by 2022. They made a plan and they got started. Step 1, power homes with solar. Makes sense. Do some energy efficiency at the moment. They didn't need to make it complicated, they did bulk buys. They made it really easy. Secondly, start doing installation of monitoring equipment so they knew how much solar was going in and how much extra renewables they needed to get in. Then they started doing batteries, and they partnered with a local company called Mondo Power to do that installation and do it in a smart way so that they could start connecting these up and managing them dynamically to meet the local needs through a virtual power plant and a microgrid. And now they're just in the planning stage to build their own solar farm, and they've also created their own community-owned retailer. So that the money that they usually spend on their electricity bills that goes out to your AGLs and your Origins and your Energy Australias to make them really rich stays circulating in the local economy. So it's been a really interesting path. Totally Renewable Yakandanda is now one of 14 community renewable energy groups in the electorate of Indi. I wonder why there wasn't such a good independent elected there recently. Anyway, I think it's a pretty inspiring story, and there's 105 community energy groups across the country, so lots to learn from if that's of interest to you. So that's why it's happening. 5 reasons, and the thing is, it's really important to know that experts agree it's absolutely 100% doable to achieve 100% renewables for Australia. In fact, it's possible to achieve 100% renewable electricity, 100% renewable energy, which includes for our transport and industry, and also start to export. So there have been 9 studies, I was involved in one of them, that show how we can achieve 100% renewables. They're all slightly different pathways. One of the earliest ones was by an organisation called Beyond Zero Emissions. They did the sort of flagship one. That then led to political pressure that led to the Australian Energy Market Operator to do its own 100% renewable study. Recently ANU's done one, UNSW, a whole range of CSIRO and Energy Networks Australia have done their own version. This is the trajectory we are on. We've also heard recently that the Australian Energy Market Operator is currently developing a grid plan for Australia to get to 80% emissions reduction by 2030. It's not quite 100% renewables, but it's pretty bloody close. And that's the planning for what kind of transmission infrastructure we're going to need. So that's like next level planning. And the good thing is, not only is this technically and economically a good idea, it's also a good idea for a whole other range of other reasons. There are more where is the renewable energy in Australia? It's in regional Australia. That means that there are huge numbers of regional jobs, and if we get it right and we get the policy settings right, it's not just the construction jobs. all the operations jobs, it's the training jobs and the supply chain jobs. You know, there are big opportunities, but we've got to get the policy settings right because the market doesn't just deliver these magically with a wand. We get cleaner air. You know, coal-fired power stations in Australia are responsible for some of the worst air pollution. We have worse air pollution standards in Australia than China does. You know, so that's a bit of a challenge. So that's a health threat. Renewables does not have that health threat. So it's a healthier future for consumers, for our children, and we can control our energy bills. Renewable energy is cheaper. It lowers wholesale prices. If you put solar on your roof, it's the way to take control of your energy bills back from those big gentailers. And finally, of course, this is the key strategy to combating climate change. So one of the key reasons I've been brought here today is to tell you that gas is not a transition fuel. It is not a transition fuel. This is that grid plan that I was talking to you about. It's called the Integrated System Plan. It's done by the Australian Energy Market Operator. They did a version, they released it last year. This was their sort of mid-scale plan, which would see us get to 50% renewables by 2030. Look at how much gas gets used in this transition away from coal to renewable energy. Pretty much the same amount. So we're not necessarily going to get completely off gas anytime soon, but we certainly don't need to grow the amount of gas in our power sector. And Bruce already explained the reason why. We're moving away from baseload gas plants to peaking gas plants. And they only use gas a handful of days a year or a handful of hours every week. So that's the power sector, and that underpins the rest of what I'm going to talk about. So, next one, households. How do we get households, and when I say households, I also mean small businesses and buildings like this. How do we get them on gas? Well, it's actually pretty simple. What do we use gas for in our households? We use it for space heating, we use it for water heating, and we use it for cooking. Now, old electric stoves were not that fun to cook on, right? You know, people like gas cooking because it's more responsive. Well, now we've got induction stoves which use magnets, and they're as responsive, if not more responsive, than gas cooking. It's pretty fun to cook on induction stovetops. They exist. They're a little bit expensive at the moment. We need to bring down the costs. We do that by buying more of them and a little bit of government support. Let's go to space heating. Who here has an air conditioner in their home? Do you use it for heating as well as cooling? No? Well, you're losing money. If you used your air conditioner for heating, you would save about $600 a year. Now, my parents have a gas fire, and it broke about a month ago, and so they're like, what do we do? What do we replace it with? I'm like, well, you've already got an air conditioner, you don't really need to replace it. And they're like, yeah, we don't like the heat out of the air conditioner, it makes us really dry. So, alright, okay, I go to this great Facebook group called My Efficient Electric Home. If you're interested in this, I recommend it. And I went, what do I do? And it turns out there is an air conditioner out there that also has radiant heating. It also heats up a front plate, and then that radiates heat into the space. So you get a nicer, more gas-like heating effect. So, you know, if that kind of level of concern is your level of concern, there are technologies out there for you. Then, water heating. Solar hot water, pretty straightforward. Evacuated tubes have been on roofs for 20 or 30 years now. Then you also have electric heat pumps. They're like air conditioners, but for hot water. They are the most efficient form of heating of hot water out there. If you combine it with solar PV, wham bam, zero emissions, highly efficient hot water. Yep, we can get households off gas. In fact, Renew, which was previously called ATA, found that from 2014, if you were building a new house and connecting it to the gas grid, you were like crazy. Yeah, it is cheaper, it has been cheaper to not connect houses to the gas grid since 2014, and that was before LNG exports really started in earnest and gas prices went through the roof. So that's households, pretty straightforward. Replacing gas in industry. This is harder, but it is entirely possible with technologies that exist right now. So what do we use gas for in industry? We use it for two things. We use it for feedstock, for chemical processes, and we use it for heating. So this is a very tiny graph. Basically, there are three main sectors, industrial sectors that use a lot of gas, metals and aluminium at the top, chemicals and ammonia in the middle, and then non-metallic metals and cement. Replacing gas as a feedstock is, to make chemicals is going to be hard, so let's reserve some of that. But using it for heating, we can do that. Already ammonia, no, I'll talk about ammonia later. Then in terms of the mass market, who are the main large users of gas? It's food manufacturing. A lot of those food manufacturing places are in the regions. So what do we do to support these types of companies get off gas? Well, what we do is we provide alternative sources of heat. There are three main electrical sources of heat. I talked about heat pumps for households. You make them a bunch bigger and a little bit more complicated. You can do it for industrial processes. They're really good and cost effective for any heat process up to about 100 or 150 degrees Celsius, which is a lot of the mass market food production kind of uses of heat. Then you've got electromagnetic heating, those induction stoves I was talking about, scale it up, again, for industry. You create these furnaces with electromagnets. And then you've got electric arc furnaces, and that's what we already use in steel recycling. So increasingly, instead of, refining new steel, we take a whole bunch of scrap steel and we melt it at high temperatures in these electric arc furnace things. So they're what we need for really high temperature processes, 1,000 degrees and higher. Then you've got a couple of sources of heat that you can get directly from renewable energy. So solar thermal heat, those evacuated tubes that you use on your roof, they can also be used for low temperature heat in industry. And then people seen a concentrating solar thermal power tower, right? One of these. Where you've got a power tower and you've got a bunch of mirrors that reflect heat onto that power tower, and that generates heat and is transferred through a medium, and you can use that for heating industrial processes. You can also use bioenergy, just going back one. So I'm not advocating that you chop down and burn large forests. That's probably not a good idea, but collecting agricultural waste, digesting them, and creating methane and using that biogas to generate heat, that's one form. There's a whole range of other pathways for sustainable bioenergy as well. One of the things that this is sort of the new frontier. There has been stuff happening around it, around the world for a decade, 15, 20 years, but it's only really starting to get traction here in Australia in the last few years because the gas price is so high and because the renewables price is so low. So one of the things that we need is to do a lot more and get many, many more case study examples of how industry can get off gas through using a range of these different technologies. There's two reports if you want to find out more. One by Beyond Zero Emissions, which was around electrifying industry that got released last year, and the other by IT Power, which was looking at renewable alternatives for gas and heating, and they did that for the Australian Renewable Energy Agency. But certainly what BZE found was that there is no industrial heating process that cannot be replaced by electrification or renewable heat, and that it has additional benefits of halving the amount of energy we use to produce many of our goods, halving the amount of energy, reducing costs in the process, and increasing production speeds. Using those electromagnetic heating processes use a fraction of the time that it takes to get something into a blast furnace and melt it down. So there's a whole bunch of co-benefits. I just pulled out 2 examples. There's a winery near Griffith in New South Wales. They're using those evacuated tube solar hot water as well as solar panels to preheat a bunch of their bottling processes at an industrial scale. Then there's Sundrop Tomato Farms. People heard of them? I like them. They're in South Australia. They've built this pretty high-tech solar array, and that is using pumping heat into a greenhouse, which is used to grow tomatoes on an industrial scale. So that's
you said
getting
you're going to come back to ammonia.
Yeah, I'm about to. Ammonia. Okay, so how do we replace our gas exports? Well, I'm not talking about necessarily using the LNG plants in Gladstone, but how do we replace the income that isn't actually really coming into Australia because of the LNG imports? But I think when we think about coal exports, when we think about gas exports, one of the reasons that we can't move to renewables is what happens to our exports. Well, we can export renewable energy. Remember that map? We have the best renewable energy resources in the world. Well, there's a bunch of ways that we can export renewables. I'm going to focus on 3. The first, hydrogen. People heard of hydrogen? People are very excited about hydrogen at the moment. The COAG Energy Council has just released a suite of different documents around hydrogen. CSIRO did a hydrogen roadmap last year. The chief scientist has been on a hydrogen mission for the last couple of years. So how does it work? The first thing to say is that there's good hydrogen and bad hydrogen. Good hydrogen is powered by renewables, and I'm going to explain how that works in a moment. Bad hydrogen uses either gas or coal to generate hydrogen. Bad form of hydrogen, let's not go there. People are trying to go there, don't let the gas industry take you there. So, how does good hydrogen work? First, you purify water, desalination basically, whether it's on land or near the sea, probably given how dry and in drought much of Australia is, it's going to be near the sea. Then water is split into oxygen and hydrogen. Oxygen gas bubbles off and hydrogen is then used, it's then converted. It uses an electrolyser that is powered by renewable energy. Remember, we've got massive amounts of renewable resource, and sometimes we're going to produce more electricity than we need. What do we do with that excess electricity? We electrolyse water. We generate hydrogen. Then, if we want to export it and not use it here to clean up our ammonia industry, which we could do, because ammonia is one of the biggest sources and users of hydrogen in solar thermal heat, those evacuated tubes that you use on your roof, they can also be used for low temperature heat in industry. And then people seen a concentrating solar thermal power tower, right? One of these, where you've got a power tower and you've got a bunch of mirrors that reflect heat onto that power tower, and that generates heat and is transferred through a medium, and you can use that for heating industrial processes. You can also use bioenergy, just going back one. So I'm not advocating that you chop down and burn large forests. That's probably not a good idea, but collecting agricultural waste, digesting them, and creating methane and using that biogas to generate heat, that's one form. There's a whole range of other pathways for sustainable bioenergy as well. One of the things that this is sort of the new frontier. There has been stuff happening around it, around the world for a decade, 15, 20 years, but it's only really starting to get traction here in Australia in the last few years because the gas price is so high and because the renewables price is so low. So one of the things that we need is to do a lot more and get many, many more case study examples of how industry can get off gas through using a range of these different technologies. There's 2 reports if you want to find out more. One by Beyond Zero Emissions, which was around electrifying industry that got released last year, and the other by IT Power, which was looking at renewable alternatives for gas and heating, and they did that for the Australian Renewable Energy Agency. But certainly what BZE found was that there is no industrial heating process that cannot be replaced by electrification or renewable heat, and that it has additional benefits of halving the amount of energy we use to produce many of our goods, halving the amount of energy, reducing costs in the process, and increasing production speeds. Using those electromagnetic heating processes use a fraction of the time that it takes to get something into a blast furnace and melt it down. So there's a whole bunch of co-benefits. I just pulled out 2 examples. There's a winery near Griffith in New South Wales. They're using those evacuated tube solar hot water as well as solar panels to preheat a bunch of their bottling processes at an industrial scale. Then there's Sundrop Tomato Farms. People heard of them? I like them. They're in South Australia. They've built this pretty high-tech solar array, and that is pumping heat into a greenhouse, which is used to grow tomatoes on an industrial scale. So, that's
You said
getting
you're going to come back to ammonia.
Yeah, I'm about to. Ammonia! Okay, so how do we replace our gas exports? Well, I'm not talking about necessarily using the LNG plants in Gladstone, but how do we replace the income that isn't actually really coming into Australia because of the LNG imports? But I think when we think about coal exports, when we think about gas exports, one of the reasons that we can't move to renewables is what happens to our exports. Well, we can export renewable energy. Remember that map? We have the best renewable energy resources in the world. Well, there's a bunch of ways that we can export renewables. I'm going to focus on 3. The first, hydrogen. People heard of hydrogen? People are very excited about hydrogen at the moment. The COAG Energy Council has just released a suite of different documents around hydrogen. CSIRO did a hydrogen roadmap last year. The chief scientist has been on a hydrogen mission for the last couple of years. So how does it work? The first thing to say is that there's good hydrogen and bad hydrogen. Good hydrogen is powered by renewables, and I'm going to explain how that works in a moment. Bad hydrogen uses either gas or coal to generate hydrogen. Bad form of hydrogen, let's not go there. People are trying to go there, don't let the gas industry take you there. So, how does good hydrogen work? First, you purify water, desalination basically, whether it's on land or near the sea, probably given how dry and in drought much of Australia is, it's going to be near the sea. Then water is split into oxygen and hydrogen. Oxygen gas bubbles off and hydrogen is then used, it's then converted. It uses an electrolyser that is powered by renewable energy. Remember, we've got massive amounts of renewable resource, and sometimes we're going to produce more electricity than we need. What do we do with that excess electricity? We electrolyse water. We generate hydrogen. Then, if we want to export it and not use it here to clean up our ammonia industry, which we could do, because ammonia is one of the biggest sources and users of hydrogen in the electricity semi-cartel, continue to gouge customers, and as long as we keep building renewables at scale, at the rate we're going right now, or even quicker. So, our challenge to finish off with is that this transition, particularly in the electricity sector, is now inevitable. It's not quite inevitable in the industrial sector. We need to get some of the momentum going. We need to build the industry capacity and knowledge and supply chains so it becomes something that people think of doing, because currently they don't think to switch away from gas. But what we need to do is make this transition faster as climate change demands, but also as communities like this one should demand, because in this future, this clean energy future, the gas that is under Narrabri is just not needed. And we should also demand that that energy transition and that future energy system is a lot fairer. So I'm going to finish up there and say thank you. So Naomi and Simon, I'm just, as well as doing this kind of presentation, I do a bit of facilitation. And just to mix things up a little bit, and sorry Simon, blame Naomi. Before you ask maybe some questions of me, I wanted to suggest you turn to two of your neighbours and have a chat in a group of 3 around what came up for you in my talk. How might this be relevant to the work that you're doing here in Narrabri and the Northwest? And is there one good question that your group could come up with? Yeah? And we'll just do that for 3 or 4 minutes.
Huge area in central Australia where we could produce solar power and so on. How do we get a grid system which is made to go from the outside, well, the coastal areas of Australia to the inland? How do we get a grid system in place to, when we generate all that electricity inland, to go back to the coast?
So 3 things. The first is, well, we need to build out the integrated system plan that AEMO has been envisioning, and they've identified a series of renewable energy zones at the edge of where we already have transmission inland. And so the first step is to build that out, so that we strengthen the transmission infrastructure out to the New England and then beyond out here. The second is by looking at those subsea cables in Western Australia and Northern Territory, because if you're building big cables internationally, it's not much more to then tack on, a little interconnection from Tennant Creek in the Northern Territory down to Port Augusta in South Australia, or across to Mount Isa in Queensland, or somewhere like that. The third is around new transmission technologies. So we use AC, alternating current, in our transmission system and distribution system. They're the most efficient way of transporting really long distances is using DC cables. So we also need to build up the industry capacity to build these big DC cables here in Australia. Yeah?
Because we've got that capacity inland to generate. We've got to get that power to the coast to then generate the hydrogen.
But I think the other thing to say is that the quality of the solar power that we have in the coastal areas is still better than places like Germany, and they have more solar installed in Germany than we do here in Australia.
Just on that subject with the distribution, and if we can separate the particularly east-west, and so that, for argument's sake, photovoltaics are generating 2 o'clock in the afternoon and yet supplying on the eastern states the 6 to 7 o'clock peak periods. Is there any plans to have that? Because that would negate a lot of the need for battery storage systems if the electricity can ebb and flow sort of east-west across.
East-west, yeah.
Yeah.
So,
and also cloudy and non-cloudy areas, obviously.
Yeah. So UNSW did the best research at looking at how do you get least cost 100% renewables. And they just did it for our own electricity supply. And so they compared greater geographical interconnection, they compared battery storage, and they also looked at demand-side solutions like demand response, which might be as simple as turning your off-peak hot water from nighttime to the middle of the day when the sun is shining. So the cheapest way of sort of integrating solar and large amounts of variable renewables into our system is that demand response, so shifting the way we use some of our electricity. And I'm not saying that we should be, you know, stingy and not turn the lights on during the night to enjoy ourselves, but like, you know, there are some things that we do that we could do in the middle of the day instead of the middle of the night. So how do we shift that, and particularly in industry more so than at a household level? So that's the first and the quickest way to do that. The second is interconnecting the grid that we already have and strengthening it will open up a whole bunch of areas. I think east-west DC cables only start to make sense if you're really starting to do renewable exports at scale. So, yeah, because transmission and distribution networks are expensive, particularly for a population as small as Australia. So to make them cost effective, you have to have as many electrons flowing through them as possible. So we need to, if we're looking to build, you know, those big cables, we need to be, you know, having a much higher electricity demand than we currently do. And that means, you know, bringing some of that manufacturing from offshore to onshore so that it's being done in Australia where it's got cheaper and cleaner power than it does in other places. Or exporting large amounts of renewable energy through hydrogen or cables. So, you know, I think those east-west, north-south large DC cables are 10 to 15 years away in terms of, you know, and will happen if we really look to make Australia a renewable superpower.
Question about hydrogen.
Yeah.
250 years ago, when we started burning large amounts of coal, we didn't project that there was going to be this vast amount of carbon dioxide which was going to create climate change. If we go in the direction of hydrogen production, do we risk reducing the amount of oxygen in the atmosphere as one possibility? And if we're taking it from seawater, are we risking increasing the salinity of the ocean? These are questions that, you know, 250 years in the future, they'll be cursing us.
Yeah, so I think the first thing is you won't be taking oxygen out of the atmosphere. That'll still be there, and when you burn hydrogen you create water, so water vapour you take out will go back into the natural cycle. So it's much more part of the natural cycle than, you know, digging up fossil fuels is. But are there potential unintended consequences? Absolutely, and you nailed the one that I'm most concerned on the head, which is around the level of water that you need, and, you know, where do we have the largest volumes of water? You know, it's from the coast. And when I was an engineer and an engineering student and an engineering graduate, I did a lot to say we didn't need desalination, and now I'm coming to you 12 years later going, maybe desalination isn't the worst idea if it generates this hydrogen. You know, the thing that I haven't talked to is energy efficiency. The cleanest energy is the energy we don't use. So how can we increase the energy of the efficiency and the productivity of every single way in which we're using energy? And I don't mean using energy frugally and turning the heater off at 7 p.m. at night and going to bed early. I mean, actually building homes that aren't leaky tents, because our building standards in Australia are horrific. In our industrial sector, we are 22nd of 25 OECD countries in terms of industrial energy efficiency. Electrifying transport, electrifying industry does increase the energy efficiency of those processes. So how can we make sure that things are as efficient as possible? Where do we need hydrogen? In the global economy, it's for some of those really smaller island, highly dense island places, and that they want to power industry and transport with hydrogen. And where else do we need hydrogen? Maybe as a little bit of a feedstock, and also probably as part of steel production that doesn't generate electricity, that doesn't use coking coal. So those are 4 applications, they're niche applications. If you talk to the hydrogen industry, they want to power all of our cars and buses and everything with hydrogen. And actually there is the fifth application is freight. How do we clean up the shipping industry? So hydrogen has potentially got a role to play there. So, if we want to live the way we do now, then there is a niche role for hydrogen. Then there are niche roles for hydrogen, but there are some applications where we shouldn't use it. And in our homes is another great example. The gas industry really wants to sees hydrogen as its saviour. How do they not have stranded gas assets and gas pipelines? By using renewable hydrogen. No, we don't want to use hydrogen in our homes. We don't need to. We can electrify our homes. So we need to push back on a range of different applications of hydrogen. And then we need to be more efficient. So, for example, in steel production, if we recycle much more of our steel rather than create new steel, then we can use electric arc furnaces, not having to use hydrogen. So if we move to a more circular economy, we also become more efficient and we reduce the need for those more complex and less clear-cut energy solutions like hydrogen. Up the back? Up the back?
Me?
Yeah.
I just noticed in your presentation that you recognise that methane's a feedstock for some industries, and you suggested that some gas should be reserved for that purpose. But later in your presentation, when you were talking about renewable heat for industry, you referred to bioenergy and biodigesters. Is there an economics issue with using the methane from biodigesters as a feedstock for industry, and that is why you suggested we reserve gas as the feedstock?
I think it's about, well, where is the highest value application of the existing gas that we have? My understanding from people who know this better than me is it is in a feedstock, chemical feedstock capacity. Can we use other feedstocks? Yes. First, we can use hydrogen to create synfuels, synthetic fuels, which use that hydrogen. You combine that renewable hydrogen with carbon and create a fuel that then becomes a feedstock. The second, you can use bioenergy and biogas. My concern around biogas and bioenergy is that there's good forms of it and bad forms of it. And a large scale, what we're seeing in some places, they're chopping down old growth forests in the US and Canada and creating wood pellets and using them as renewable energy in places like Scotland, Finland, and Germany. That is not a good environmental outcome. We don't want to create a bioenergy industry on a chemical feedstock scale because of the potential environmental impacts of the bioenergy feedstocks. And we're taking away productive agricultural land from being crops for food production to crops for energy crops. And there are sustainable forms of one of the ways that I'm really keen on bioenergy is using mallee as shelter belts, and then you coppice the top, and then you use that coppicing as a form of energy. But can that be done at a scale to satisfy Orica down in Sydney and Melbourne? I'm not sure it can be at this point, or we want them to be. Yeah? Yeah?
Just a question on solar thermal. Is that, have we got any solar thermal in Australia producing electricity, and do you see it as being a part of the renewable energy future?
No, we don't have it yet as part of our electricity generation mix. There's a couple of trial projects, but not at any kind of scale or not commercial. There was a plan and a lot of campaigning work that went into seeing a concentrating solar thermal plant being planned to be built in Port Augusta in South Australia, the Repower Port Augusta campaign. If you don't know about it, check it out. And they got the federal government, both sides of politics, to commit about $100 million in concessional loans. They got the state government to run a tender process, which the solar thermal project ran to supply the South Australian government's electricity needs. Unfortunately, the economics of South Australian electricity system changed, and the company Solar Reserve that was planning on building it is also having some global challenges. So that project just fell over about 3 months ago. So do I think that there is a role for solar thermal in Australia and in the global energy future? Yes, but I think it's in as a niche. We're moving from one paradigm of electricity supply to a different one. Previously in the 20th century, we had base load power stations, coal, nuclear, gas, and peaking power stations, hydro and peaking gas. And the reason it was base load was because big thermal generators couldn't turn on and off quickly. So they were most efficient if they ran all the time at the same rate. That's why we have off-peak hot water and things like that, to artificially ramp up the amount of electricity demand overnight. We're moving away from that paradigm to a paradigm of bulk generation coming from the cheapest form of electricity, which will be wind and solar PV. And then we need to fill the gaps. You know, as our opponents say, when the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow, what do we use? Well, we use sustainable bioenergy, we use batteries, we use pumped hydro storage, and we use concentrating solar thermal and demand response. So that's the combination of the technologies that will fill and plug those gaps. Hope that answers.
So they're not really efficient at this stage?
So concentrating solar thermal isn't as modular as things like battery storage and solar PV, so it hasn't had a cost reduction curve the same way that solar PV has. That said, Mark was telling me in the car today that costs in solar thermal have reduced by something like 46% since 2010 in concentrating solar thermal. So if we see more deployment of it, particularly here in Australia, it will come down in costs, but we need government investment and government intervention to be able to establish that new industry.
Just a question about community solar, and how do we, at those early steps in that Yakandanda outline you gave, how do we involve people who can't afford to put things on their roof, panels on their roof?
Yeah, so my organisation, we do a lot of work around solar for all. What are the solutions that enable everyone to be able to access solar? So at the moment, due to some good campaigning work, the New South Wales State Government has got a loan program where you can buy and install solar for zero upfront cost, or almost zero upfront cost. So that's one way. But then what about if you've got a shaded roof, or you rent, or you, well, don't think many people live in an apartment in this part of the world, but that's another challenge. There are a range of different models out there. We're working on one called a solar garden, which is the idea that you have a solar farm, and I buy my 5 kilowatts of that solar farm, and then I partner with an electricity provider, and they credit the electricity on my bill. Doesn't work in Australia yet because it's just complex. There's no regulatory reason, it's just complex and thus financially marginal. But if you want to know more, we're going to launch a campaign in a month's time. So follow Community Power Agency on Twitter. It's not up there. You can find us. But I think, in terms of how do you involve people, like one of the simplest things to do is start by putting solar on the childcare centre. People who might not necessarily be able to access solar or might not know about it might have kids in that childcare centre and might want to know more. So you might then be able to, by fundraising to put solar on the childcare centre, then engage them and point them in the direction of the state government's concessional loan schemes. Our suggestion, if you're interested in community energy, is start small, start simple, and then get more sophisticated.
Nicky, between here and the coast, there are some councils now objecting to solar because they are taking up prime agricultural land. How's that fitting in with your projects?
So we have a lot of land in Australia that isn't necessarily prime agricultural land, so maybe we should be using more of that, is the first thing. The second thing is, and in all seriousness, you can structure solar farms so you can run sheep and cattle, or you can co-crop alongside it. It's not necessarily the cheapest way of doing solar, but you can absolutely do it. We've been working with a solar developer in Uralla, and that's what they're doing. I've worked in renewables for a decade, and I come around and I give this type of presentation, and Despite all that, I'm not the biggest fan of the renewable energy industry. They're an industry like any other. If you want them to create benefits for your local community, you've got to ask for it and negotiate and demand it. And my organisation is trying to help communities do that. So get in touch if you want to be able to get the best outcomes of solar from this community. And certainly, I know Lock the Gate commissioned one of my colleagues at ISF to do a study of solar and renewable potential in the Narrabri Shire, and what they found is that there was more renewable energy potential and more job potential and less use of less land use than gas, directly compared, and he excluded strategic agricultural land. So, you know, is renewable energy always done well? No. Can renewable energy be done much better than gas? And is renewable energy generally much better than gas? Yes and yes. Up the back. Yep.
Yeah, look, when we moved to Glen Innes 2 years ago, we put 10 kilowatts of panels on the top of our roof. We're only given permission to export 5 because of the capacity of the wires.
Yep.
I just want to ask you about the impact of the sale of the poles and wires in New South Wales. I don't know what the situation is in Victoria with Yakandana and that, but the impact of that private ownership of the poles and wires, the near monopoly of energy maintenance and supply in rural New South Wales, impact of that on the community power schemes, and secondly, when can you come to Glen Innes?
As soon as you invite me.
Done.
Okay, we'll talk about it tonight. So, first thing to say is actually Essential Energy, which is the distribution network provider in most of regional New South Wales, isn't privatised. It is still publicly owned. That doesn't mean that they aren't rorting customers. They absolutely still are. The second, there are legislative, there are regulated reasons they're able to do that. That's the first thing. The second thing is, there are genuine reasons why, engineering reasons why it's difficult to export solar in some places. There are things like voltage fluctuations. What I'm really excited about is a company based out of Brisbane called Planet Arc Power. They've created a new bit of kit that's getting global prizes at the moment, where if you install this bit of kit with your solar array, it manages the voltage fluctuations, and so you can export much more power. Is it necessarily going to be economical for a 10 kilowatt system? No, maybe not, but it would be economical for this bowling club, for a 100 kilowatt or a 200 kilowatt or a 500 kilowatt system. So, there are technical advances and innovations that are happening to address those exact issues that, many households, businesses, farmers are facing at the moment. I think we're finishing up now.
Right, thank